Hi, and welcome back to the Lovers of God video series. My name is Paul Berthen. This is actually the fifth video. If you haven't seen the other videos, I highly recommend you go back and start from the beginning, which would be actually probably video number 2. Talks about the relationship paradigm. It helps kind of build up towards the rational way of thinking of what we're doing here, and helps you to better kind of get a foundation to make sense of this whole paradigm we've been talking about. But today I want to talk about something that's very special. This is actually about the condition of the soul. And so I want to jump right into it and get right to the points so that we can find some conclusion in this area. Okay, this is the relationship paradigm. And this is what I introduced last week was the 3 new elements to kind of help complete the relationship paradigm, introducing the soul, the heart, mind, and how that relates to the elements of love, good, evil, and will. But what I want to talk about today is the soul. And I mentioned last time that the soul is the authentic self. And there's a condition of the soul that humanity suffers with. It's what I call what we languish from. And there are 4 existential wounds or sufferings that the soul experiences. And that's shame, longing, self-contempt, and fear. And so I want to break this down and give you an idea of where we're at and what it is that we need to be healed from and delivered from in order to have authentic, real relationships with one another, ourselves, and with the Father. So let's go back to the very beginning of where these 4 existential wounds came from. And it goes back into the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve had the perfect relationship with the Father. There, the paradigm relationship was seen actually there. It was set up in this way. You had the loving connection between the 3 of them, Adam and Eve and the Father. They had all the trees that they could eat from. And then in the middle of the garden was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the condition was this: as long as they didn't eat of the fruit, they were obeying the Father's wishes and living in goodness. If they were to pick the fruit, then of course they experienced evil for the first time, which was a disobedience to the Father. And the tree allowed for them to exercise their will. And so that was the setting. The tree gave them that freedom of choice. So you see all 4 elements: love, good, evil, and the will that was there. Well, the Father says, the day that you eat of this forbidden fruit, you will surely die. And what was the death that occurred? Well, the death was between the relationship of the union of the Father and fellowship with Him and Adam and Eve. And there was a separation that occurred. And out of the separation came the wound of the soul, the shame, longing, self-contempt, and fear. And this is how it played out. When they ate of the fruit, Adam and Eve realized that they were naked, which is a sense of shame. And they clothed themselves with fig leaves. They covered themselves to hide from this deep sense of shame is the feeling like you need to hide. You can't look at one another. There's a sense of just loathing of oneself. It's almost like self-hatred or self-woundedness. And so the shame is a very powerful emotion that people will do anything to avoid that feeling. And so they felt naked, and that's what that represents. And out of their shame and nakedness, there's a fear that comes. And this is the second wound. And so when God came into the garden, He's calling out to Adam and Eve because they were hiding from themselves. A sense of, don't look upon me. The shame is too much, and I'm naked. And the fear is a fear of judgment, the fear of punishment and rejection. And so they hid from the Father. You can see this soul, what happened to the soul. It wasn't there before. And this is the result of the evil that brings to the soul. And of course, God finds them out. They come forward. He confronts them. And this is where self-contempt comes in, the sense of anger towards oneself. And out of that anger, when you're upset, you're so frustrated that you tend to end up looking for excuses, looking a way to not feel this sense of contempt, and so you end up blaming or making excuses. And you can see where Adam blames Eve, and then Eve blames the serpent. Okay? This is that self-contempt, that wound. And lastly, there is the longing. When they were banned from the garden and the presence of the Father, there's a sense of great loss because they remembered what they once had in the union and the fellowship and the beauty. And so there is that that longing that expresses itself in the sense of hunger and thirst. And this is important because this is how Jesus presented the gospel and the healing of these 4 wounds. He says, look, those who hunger and thirst, okay, he says in the sense that I am the bread of life. If you eat the bread that I give you, you will not hunger any longer. So he's beginning to address the condition of the soul. And it's important because how the soul ended up here was because of the death to the relationship, the separation. We were created to be lovers of God. That's who we are. It's the essence of who we are. It's the most important thing in our life. It's our first calling, is to fulfill and be the lovers of God. And when we chose to no longer be the lovers of God, but be lovers of ourselves or lovers of the world or other gods, that fellowship was broken. And so what is left is the absence of the Father, and from the absence of the Father comes these symptoms. The cause is the absence of the Father, and the symptoms are shame, fear, self-contempt, and longing. And those wounds are with us, all of humanity. We are born in this condition, and we inherit that from our fathers and grandfathers and all the way back to Adam and Eve. And the condition precipitates itself because there's the absence of the Father. That's where sin comes from, is the absence of the Father. The cause is that absence. And the sin are symptoms that come from how our soul languishes and suffers under these 4 existential pains or wounds that we feel. In fact, we probably have now 100 years of understanding the condition of the soul. This is what psychology has come into. It's given us a language to understand the conditions. And this is my background. There's a diagnostic manual called the DSM-4 that has roughly around 300 mental health conditions or diagnoses of the soul. In fact, psychology or psyche means soul. So we know how the soul suffers. We have all these diagnoses, and you could probably categorize them into four areas. You have personality disorders, which would come under their issue of shame. Okay, it's the cause of these conditions. And give an example: narcissistic personality disorder is someone who is highly sensitive and aware of the shame that is within them. And a way of coping is to deny it, to suppress it, and to be always right. And so there's a sense of deep control, of controlling other people. For them to admit that there is any sense of failure within them or wrongness in them is to suffer this deep pain of shame. And so it's expressed by being the opposite of trying to be always right and good, and everyone else is wrong and less. And so they're a very controlling type of a person. And the same thing with fear. You have the anxiety disorders of anxiousness and paranoia and so forth, and that's expressed in that wound. And then you have self-contempt, which would be the mood disorders. For example, depression. And depression is anger turned inward. And so people who suffer from that anger and the woundedness from that is expressed in those disorders. And of course, longing is your obsessive compulsive disorders, which you find the addictions. So you have drug and alcohol addiction, you have sex addiction, you have food addiction, you have all kinds of obsessions. And now these are the extreme end of the result of these 4 wounds. And so we, as a society, we suffer to some degree or another with these mental health issues. But it even goes deeper than that. You have the continuum over on this side where, well, I don't have any of these types of problems, but you still are suffering from these 4 wounds, and you express it in different ways, more maybe appropriate to social norms, but it's still there. And there's something else that if you were to think about how we view mental health issues, we tend to identify the cause as most people as early childhood issues, and out of those traumas or deficits, we then express it into a lot of mental health issues. Well, I take it a little bit further than that. True, what happens is if you were born with these wounds, you inherit them, they're passed down in our DNA, as well as experience with the absence of the father. Okay? You have, it's like if you're suffering, if you're hurting, if you were to stub your toe, that pain takes control. You can't think of anything, you can't do much of anything, you just feel this pain and you want the pain to stop. And so the soul has this pain and it wants to stop the pain. But the only way it knows how is to turn to the world. The father is absent, see? So it turns to the world to try to minimize or to bring a sense of relief and comfort. And this is where it all begins. And so as an infant, it's seeking comfort, it's seeking a sense of relief, and always looking to the care provider, the parent, to rescue it from these unexpressed or unidentifiable like emotions. And you can see it when kids begin to grow up, how they become very like demanding, and especially when they're in called the terrible twos. If they don't get some sense of satisfaction, they throw a tantrum. They really are responding to these deep wounds. It's not necessarily the parents or the conditions of the environment. What they do is they begin to add to or confirm the conditions that are there. So as a child grows up and there's conflicts in the relationship, they begin to experience some severe trauma in their life, whether it would be some form of abuse or neglect. Then those wounds become like re-wounded. They become, confirmed, you might say, that, oh, I really am a shameful person. Nobody loves me. Look at the way they treat me, say. And so you begin to deeply believe more, and you sink deeper into a sense of darkness and denial and helplessness. And so this carries out into adult life. And in a lot of ways the soul tries to survive is to suppress and deny these strong emotions and cover them up with activities and things and like say obsessions and it goes on and on and on. And so it's important to understand this is the condition of the soul. Okay? And where do we go from here? Well, this is the gospel. This is the salvation that we have. Is that God has come and Christ has come to lead us back to the Father. The Father is not withholding his love. He's always reaching out to us in love. It's our condition, just like Adam and Eve. We're the ones that are running and hiding from the Father because of the shame and the sense of fear and self-contempt. And so we're the ones that need to be healed from this. And the only way to be healed, of course, is to restore the relationship with the Father. Restore our identity as lovers. And when we come into fellowship with the Father, through Christ Jesus, Jesus leads us to the Father. He's the way, the truth, and the life. And no one can come to the Father except through Christ. And I'll talk a little bit more later on how a lot of that works out. But for now, it's in this healing relationship, okay, that those wounds are healed. Through the Father's love, where it becomes intimate and personal. It must be personal. Do you realize that all of a sudden the shame subsides because you're no longer feeling the shame, don't look upon me, but his love is calling you out, and you realize he loves you the way you are. In that state, he loves you. He's bringing you into his presence. You're being healed, and those wounds all of a sudden are no longer hurting like they used to hurt. This is that inward healing. And out of that, you are free from the things of the world, which you turn to somehow satisfy and comfort those wounds, which they can't. They never will be able to, and there's no way that it can, because the wound isn't in the world. The wound is between you and the Father. There's the death, there's the separation. So restoring this relationship is the deliverance and salvation of your soul. That's what this is about. And this is why it's so important to come into the intimacy of the Father, because it's what will heal you. And out of that healing, the desire to do evil or to sin subsides. That's our deliverance. And so it's important to understand that the root cause, but also out of that comes our deliverance from all of the anguish and the woundedness that we feel within the soul.